Hello, this is George Collins, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the January 9th, 2026 issue of the Toronto Star, right here from the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. So, sad news out of Minneapolis today. A picture of demonstrators confronting federal agents outside of a federal government building yesterday in Minneapolis. Anger and outrage spilled out onto Minneapolis's streets Thursday over the fatal shooting of a woman the day before by an immigration and customs enforcement officer, also known as ICE. A new shooting by U.S. federal officers in Oregon, by the way, left 2 people wounded and elicited more scrutiny of enforcement operations across the country. Hundreds of people protesting the shooting of the decedent Renee Good as she tried to drive away, all marched in freezing rain Thursday night down one of Minneapolis's major thoroughfares, chanting "ICE out now" and holding signs saying, quote, "Killer ICE off our streets," close quote. Protesters vented their outrage outside of a federal facility that's serving as a hub for the administration's latest immigration crackdown on a major city. The shooting in Portland, Oregon took place outside a hospital Thursday, and the conditions of the 2 people wounded were not immediately known. The FBI's Portland office said it is investigating. Just as it did following the Minneapolis shooting, the Department of Homeland Security, of course, not surprisingly, defended the actions of their officers in Portland, saying that the shooting occurred after a Venezuelan man with alleged gang ties and who was involved in a recent shooting tried to, quote, weaponize, close quote, his vehicle to hit the officers. It wasn't clear yet if witness video corroborates that account. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, President Trump and others in an administration have repeatedly characterized the Minneapolis shooting as an act of self-defense and cast Good, the victim, as a villain, suggesting she used her vehicle as a weapon to attack the officer who shot her. All right, story continued on page A11. Let's go there. Such a frustrating story. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, Deputy Knucklehead, said the shooting was justified and that the victim, a 37-year-old mother of 3, was, quote, a victim of left-wing ideology, close quote. Unbelievable. I can believe that her death is a tragedy, said Vance, while also recognizing that it is a tragedy of her own making, noting that the officer who killed her was injured while making an arrest last June. What does that have to do with the price of tea in China, I ask? But state and local officials and protesters rejected that characterization, with Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, who was great, by the way, saying video of the shooting shows the self-defense argument was, quote, garbage, close quote. He used another word at his press conference, initials BS. The shooting happened on the second day of the Trump administration's immigration crackdown on the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, which Homeland Security said is the biggest immigration enforcement operation ever. More than 2,000 officers are taking part, and Noem said they have already made more than 1,500 arrests. Oh, bully for them. It provoked an immediate response in the city where police killed George Floyd in 2020, with hundreds of people turning up to the scene to vent their outrage at the ICE officers and the school district canceling classes for the rest of the week as a precaution. That's poorly written. Good's death, at least the fifth tied to immigration sweeps since Trump took office, has resonated far beyond Minneapolis as protests took place or were expected this week in many large U.S. cities. A protester by the name of Shanta Hejmadi said we should be horrified, we should be saddened that our government is waging war on our citizens. On Thursday, the Minnesota agency that investigates officer-involved shootings said that it was informed, get this, that it was informed by the FBI and the U.S. Justice Department would not work with the department in investigating this, effectively ending any role for the state to determine if crimes were committed. It just gets worse and worse. Noam said the state has no jurisdiction. Well, I mean, if a crime takes place within the boundaries of the state, there is jurisdiction. So the federal U.S. Justice Department said that without complete access to the evidence, witnesses, and information collected, we cannot meet the investigative standards that Minnesota law and the public demands, said Drew Evans, the Bureau's superintendent, said. Governor Tim Walz publicly demanded the state be allowed to take part, repeatedly emphasizing that it would be, quote, very difficult for Minnesotans, close quote, to accept that an investigation that excludes the state could be fair. Noam, he said, was, quote, judge, jury, and basically executioner, close quote, during her public comments about the confrontation. Quote, people in positions of power have already passed judgment, from the president to the vice president to Kristi Noem, and who have stood and told you things that are verifiably false and verifiably inaccurate, said the governor. The mayor said, Mayor Frey said, we want to make sure that there is a check on this administration to ensure that this investigation is done for justice, not for the sake of a cover-up, close quote. Amen, Mayor Frey. Go get 'em. Several bystanders captured footage of Good's killing, which happened in a neighborhood south of downtown. The videos show an officer approaching an SUV, that was the victim's SUV, stopped across the middle of the road, and they demanded that the driver open the door, Ms. Good, and they grabbed the handle rather aggressively. Then Ms. Good and her Honda Pilot began to pull forward, and a different ICE officer standing in front of the car pulls his weapon even before she started moving and immediately fires at least 2 shots at close range, jumping back as the vehicle moves toward him. It isn't clear from the videos if the vehicle makes contact with the officer, and certainly the vehicle was going at a speed of 5 miles an hour or less at the time, and there was no indication whether the woman had interactions with ICE agents earlier. After the shooting, the SUV speeds into 2 cars parked on a curb and crashed because at that point the driver, the victim, was either dead or close to being dead. Noam hasn't publicly named the officer who shot the victim, but a Homeland Security spokesperson said her description of his injuries last summer refers to an incident in Bloomington, Minnesota, in which court documents identify him as Jonathan Ross. Ross got his arm stuck in the window of a vehicle. In this previous incident, Ross got his arm stuck in the window of a vehicle of a driver who was fleeing arrest on an immigration violation and was dragged roughly 90 meters, before he was knocked free, records show. The victim yesterday was a U.S. citizen. There was no immigration violation, and it's just the whole thing is just unbelievable. in that first incident, apparently last June, he fired his taser, but the prongs didn't incapacitate the driver, according to prosecutors, and Ross was transported to a hospital where he received more than 50 stitches. A jury found the driver guilty of assaulting a federal officer with a dangerous weapon. Department of Homeland Security Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin said the officer involved in the shooting had worked more than 10 years as a deportation officer and had been selected for the ICE Special Response Team, which includes a 30-hour tryout and additional training. McLaughlin declined to confirm the identity of the officer as Ross, the Associated Press, wasn't immediately able to locate a phone number or address for Ross, and the ICE organization no longer has a union that might comment on his behalf. The victim, shot and killed by a U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officer in Minneapolis on Wednesday, was Renee Good. She was a U.S. citizen, born in Colorado, and appears to never have been charged with anything involving law enforcement beyond a traffic ticket. In social media accounts, Good described herself as a, quote, poet and writer and wife and mom, close quote. God, could this get any sadder? She said she was currently, quote, experiencing Minneapolis, close quote, displaying a pride flag emoji on her Instagram account. A profile picture posted to Pinterest shows her smiling and holding a child against her cheek, along with posts about tattoos, hairstyles, and home decorating. Her ex-husband, who asked not to be named out of concern for the safety of their children, said his ex-wife, victim, said that the victim had just dropped off her 6-year-old son at school Wednesday and was driving home with her current partner when they encountered a group of ICE agents on a snowy street in Minneapolis, where they had moved last year from Kansas City, Missouri. Video taken by bystanders posted to social media shows an officer approaching her car, demanding she open the door, grabbing the handle. When she begins to pull forward, a different ICE officer standing in front of the vehicle pulls his weapon and immediately fires at least 2 shots into the vehicle at close range. In another video taken after the shooting, a distraught woman is seen sitting near the vehicle wailing, quote, "That's my wife. I don't know what to do," exclamation point, close quote. Calls and messages to Good's current partner received no response. Trump administration officials painted Good as a domestic terrorist. It just makes my toes curl. It's so disgustingly false. A domestic terrorist who had attempted to ram federal agents with her car. Her ex-husband said she was not an activist and he had never known her to participate in a protest of any kind. He described her as a devoted Christian who took part in youth mission trips to Northern Ireland when she was younger. She loved to sing, participating in a chorus in high school and studying vocal performance in college. She studied creative writing at Old Dominion University in Virginia and won a prize in 2020 for one of her works, according to a post on the school's English department Facebook page. She also hosted a podcast with her second husband, who died in 2023. The victim, Ms. Good, had a daughter and her son from her first marriage, who are now ages 15 and 12. Her 6-year-old son was from her second marriage. Her ex-husband said she had primarily been a stay-at-home mom in recent years, but had previously worked as a dental assistant and at a credit union. Her mother, Donna Ganger, told the Minnesota Star-Tribune the family was notified of the death late Wednesday afternoon. Her mother said that her daughter was one of the kindest people she'd ever known. She was extremely compassionate and had taken care of people all her life. Well, In other news that seemed to, again involve the misconduct of President Trump, in Venezuela, it was disclosed that citizens and foreigners had been released from Venezuelan prisons on Thursday in what a top government official described as a gesture to, quote, seek peace, close quote, less than a week after former President Nicolas Maduro was captured by U.S. forces to face federal drug trafficking charges in New York. Jorge Rodriguez, brother of the acting president Delcy Rodriguez and head of the National Assembly, said a, quote, significant number, close quote, of people would be freed, but he was not specific about how many or provide any names. Venezuelan authorities have freed political prisoners before, but the releases on Thursday were the first releases since Maduro was deposed. Human rights groups were encouraged by the releases, though it wasn't clear yet whether this might represent the early stages of a government in transition or was more of a symbolic effort to please the Trump administration, which has allowed Maduro's loyalists to stay in control even as Trump exerts pressure through crippling sanctions. Journalists, lawyers, and human rights activists were among those freed on Thursday, and families waited outside a notorious prison in hopes their loved ones would be among the released. Quote, consider this a gesture by the Bolivarian government, which is broadly intended to seek peace, said Rodriguez. As an aside, a personal aside, I don't understand the reference to a Bolivarian government, but in any event. Alfredo Romero, president of Foro Penal, an advocacy group for prisoners based in Caracas, praised Thursday's release as, quote, good news, close quote, that lifted Venezuelans' hopes that all political detainees in the country may walk free. And in local news out of Toronto, an opinion piece appeared. Apparently there were protests regarding the Israel-Gaza conflict, which is ramping up despite Trump's assurances that everything was fixed and the conflict was over. Not true. Ontario's Solicitor General has laid down the law, allegedly, relative to the protests over the Israel-Gaza conflict. The Solicitor General, Michael Kerzner, wants Toronto police to rein in public protests that cross a line. Where that line is, he won't say. In Ontario, as in the Middle East, finding the middle ground isn't as easy as it looks. There's also a fine line between political accountability and political interference. Kerzner has fired off two sharply worded letters, I don't know to who, firing off two sharply worded letters demanding that police crack down on, quote, enforcement of hate, intimidation, and harassment-motivated offenses, close quote. The Solicitor General, who is the provincial cabinet minister in charge of public security and police enforcement, points to anti-Israel protesters who disrupted Boxing Day festivities at the Eaton Center, calling it, quote, mob intimidation and harassment, close quote. He also cites the protesters who show up weekly in traditionally Jewish neighborhoods near Bathurst and Shepherd, where they chant slogans against Zionism and the Israel-Gaza conflict. Kerzner has essentially accused Toronto Police Chief Myron Demkiw, Demkiw, and Shelley Carroll, chairman of the Police Services Board, of dereliction of duty. This guy sounds like a hothead. He argues Ontario has been, quote, providing the tools, close quote, that are needed so that, quote, the responsibility now rests with police leadership, close quote, to move promptly and decisively when criminal acts of hate and intimidation are taking place. Or at least so says the minister. The police chief, however, is pleading not guilty to the Solicitor General's charges, not that he's been arrested or anything. So too is Mayor Olivia Chow, though they can't seem to get their stories straight. And let me just pause for a second and remind you that you are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. So apparently the police chief and the mayor allegedly can't get their story straight. Asked by News Talk 1010 host John Moore last month why there weren't more arrests, the mayor replied, well, I thought exactly the same thing. Why can't you arrest more people and charge more people? She said the chief's answer was that, quote, a lawyer at headquarters, close quote, keeps advising, quote, don't bother, close quote, if they can't get a conviction, saying that the chief has been saying that they have made charges, but then it gets thrown out of court by the Crown and they won't even accept it. Well, let's recap the story so far. The minister who oversees law enforcement says more needs to be done. The mayor says she'd like to see more arrests and has spoken to the chief about it, the police chief. The chief would like to clarify. Speaking the next day on Moore's radio show, the police chief said it wasn't so simple. He said, listen, I do not know where she's getting that narrative, referring to the mayor. The Crown attorneys guide us on the prospect of conviction. In other words, government lawyers are guiding the police department in terms of whether charges are appropriate. If these three community leaders are still talking past each other, it's hardly surprising that protesters are still shouting and chanting at other residents of Toronto who have nothing to do with the issue at hand. The Toronto Police Association issued its own statement after Kersner's missives appealing for, quote, clear and consistent direction to our members and the public about what is lawful and unlawful when it comes to protest activity. Clarity amidst ambiguity isn't easy. But that doesn't mean the Crown prosecutors who are paid and educated to make these decisions shouldn't be rising to the occasion and pursuing test cases as needed. For 2 years, protesters have been showing up outside the homes of Canadian Jews to loiter and litigate a conflict a world away and a country away. That transgresses the universal value that a person's private home is a private sanctuary akin to a castle and is not, for example, a consulate. For example, the Israeli consulate is fully 15 kilometers away from that neighborhood. For 2 years, protesters have been free to hold their own demonstrations on the streets and squares of Toronto, where the right to assembly and peaceful protest is protected by the Charter of Rights. But the right to free speech is hardly unlimited, and there are limitations on one's right to free speech, and freedom of assembly does not confer a right to trespass on private property. Amen. Let alone empower people to wade in with megaphones to disrupt and drown out or trample on other people's holiday celebrations in shopping malls, just as unionized workers, even in a lawful strike, cannot picket in a shopping center. To be sure, the policing of protests is always a balancing act, but trespass isn't especially ambiguous on private property. And there's a difference between peaceful protest, which is protected under the Charter, as opposed to disruptions that escalate to harassment and hatefulness. Interestingly, the former federal minister of multiculturalism, Jason Kenney, who's also ex-premier of Alberta, waded into the debate after the Boxing Day disruptions at the Eaton Center and asked why the authorities, notably his fellow Tories, couldn't get their act together. Good question. Kenny suggested that they could invoke Ontario laws against trespass or apply criminal code laws on mischief, quote, motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate, close quote, semicolon, causing a disturbance in unlawful assembly. A better question is why, if the Solicitor General is so irritated and annoyed by the lack of action, why doesn't he send a letter to his cabinet colleague, Attorney General Doug Downey, suggesting that his ministry provide clearer guidance to Crown attorneys about how to proceed? Good point. The only certainty is that we have a Solicitor General who is publicly wagging his finger, comma, a police chief who says his hands are tied, comma, a mayor who is washing her hands of the situation, comma, a police union that's throwing its hands up, and an attorney general who may be sitting on his hands. And no one is pointing the way forward. Stay tuned. Oh, boy. I just somehow managed to lose the transmission here. Let me just pause for a second, and I will be right back. Okay, got it. Alrighty, let's see here. Let's go back to the front page. Let's see if we can find some positive news here. Oh, jeez. Oh, man. All right, sorry. Opponents, all right, this is, again, Ontario news. Opponents of the Doug Ford government's controversial Ontario Place redevelopment will make their case to the Supreme Court of Canada, raising doubts about the project's future after the top court granted leave to appeal on Thursday. As is customary, Supreme Court justices gave no reason for their decision. The move follows a hearing at which lawyers for a group called Ontario Place Protectors challenged the constitutionality of legislation used by the Ford government to override environmental requirements and other potential impediments to redeveloping the once popular theme park shuttered by the previous Liberal government in 2012. Despite strong criticism, the province fast-tracked the project, bulldozing a thicket of trees on Ontario Place's West Island and making other site changes to prepare for construction of a towering glass spa and water park to be operated under a long-term lease by Therme Canada, THERME, which is part of an Austria-based company. Redevelopment plans also include an expanded Live Nation concert venue, a relocated Ontario Science Centre, and a $400 million five-story taxpayer-funded parking garage towering over Lakeshore Boulevard and obstructing waterfront views. All right, and speaking to reporters Thursday, Mr. Ford lambasted the community activists trying to thwart the Ontario Place redevelopment in court. He said, "I think it's a bunch of crazy lefties." Oh, that sounds a familiar tune, like the inhabitant of the Oval Office in Washington. "I think it's a bunch of crazy lefties that want to protect one tree or two trees or three birds, and they're bringing in the Supreme Court. But these same people, mark my words, the small group, very small, are going to be lined up to go through Ontario Place, to go to the beautiful trails, to go by the marina, to go to a concert, to go to the entire Science Center, and go to the water park, which will be spectacular." All right. Here's a baseball story in lighter news. The playoffs may be over, but the Blue Jays are still bringing joy to one Torontonian. And let me take this break to remind you that you are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And Etobicoke, Etobicoke, Etobicoke man sold George Springer's go-ahead 3-run home run ball that he caught in Game 7 of the American League Championship Series for just under $27,000 U.S. at an auction last month. The man's name, Michael Angeletti, was the lucky fan who caught the ball from his front row seats in left center field. He was seen on TV screens everywhere, jumping around in a Springer football jersey after the ball bounced into his hands in the bottom of the 7th inning to give the Blue Jays a 4-3 lead over the Seattle Mariners and eventually sent them to the World Series. The auction that ended on December 13th started at $10,000 and racked up 12 bids before going to an unknown buyer. On the night he caught the ball, Angeletti initially said he would give it to Springer. He was brought onto the outskirts of the field during Game 7 pennant celebrations, but ultimately left without making a deal. The ball came just shy of the $28,000 U.S. dollars windfall that Jose Bautista's iconic bat flip home run ball from 2015 earned at auction in 2019. Angeletti spent the first 7 innings of Game 7 texting his friends and family that he was going to be part of Blue Jays history. He didn't know when, and nobody really believed him, but he says he just knew. Angeletti said, "I told everyone in every group chat I was going to catch the big ball." The Major League Baseball generally does not authenticate home run balls unless they break records. But the auction house, Golden, was given the responsibility of selling the ball, says the buyer received, quote, provenance attesting, close quote, whatever that is, to the ball being legitimate. Angeletti shouted after he caught the home run ball, "It was fate. I'm wearing the Springer Argos jersey." He shouted after he caught the home run. "It's a magic ball. It's a magic jersey." And there was a correction made to a previously published article, and the correction says U.S. Democratic Senator Mark Kelly and 5 other congressional Democrats urged U.S. troops to refuse unlawful orders in a video in November following U.S. strikes on alleged drug trafficking boats. A January 8th opinion article about the implications of U.S. President Trump's Greenland ambitions on NATO incorrectly referred to John Kelly, who is the former White House Chief of Staff, as being in the video when it was not John Kelly, but instead was, again, Senator Mark Kelly. All right, not a biggie. All right, let's see here. Let's see if we can find some other interesting news. All right. Hospitals see surge of senior citizens with flu. Experts say virus can harm older patients' immune systems, causing prolonged hospitalizations. Physicians in Toronto hospitals are seeing a pattern in their admissions, a wave of older patients with influenza who are vulnerable to severe complications. Let me start again. Physicians in Toronto hospitals are seeing a pattern in their admissions, and this pattern is a wave of older patients with influenza who are vulnerable to severe complications such as pneumonia and trouble breathing. In Canada, people over age 65 made up nearly 32% of flu detections for the week of December 20th, which is the highest of all the age groups, according to the Public Health Agency of Canada's website. Toronto's Sunnybrook Health Science Centre saw hospitalizations for the flu peak in late December, which contributed to more than 5% of all admissions, according to Dr. Jerome Leis, medical director of Infection Prevention and Control. Patients over 65 made up 72% of these admissions. 10% reside in long-term care or retirement homes. Experts say it's difficult for an older patient to bounce back from influenza and its cascading effects on their immune system that leads to prolonged hospitalization or, heaven forbid, death. Seniors can struggle with loss of mobility and breathing difficulties and delirium, which is a serious medical condition that can cause confusion, fluctuating consciousness, and inattention. It's a common occurrence, sending older patients into a downward spiral, said Dr. Leis. It's particularly tragic, he continued, to see an older adult who has been able to function independently with some of their chronic conditions and then be tipped over towards loss of their independence after being hospitalized with the flu. This year's flu season has felt the harsh effects of H3N2, which is a new mutated strain of influenza A. It has been called a possible, quote, mismatch, close quote, for this year's flu vaccine, although doctors say it would still provide protection against the mutation. Older adults are part of the most at-risk groups for flu-related complications, which also includes people over 65, children under 5, pregnant people, and those with underlying medical conditions. In a statement, Public Health Ontario confirmed that people over 65 and children under the age of 5 have been affected more by this year's flu season compared to last year, including high hospital bed occupancy. Throughout the entire 2024-25 flu season in Ontario, there have been 36,329 active flu cases. Since this year's flu activity arrived early in October, there have been 25,622 flu cases based on data up through December 27th. The agency said the season peaked in December. Quote, "We expect influenza A activities in all ages, including children under 5 and people 65 plus, to continue to decline." Dr. Tajinder Kaura, chief of Humber River Hospital's emergency department, said many older patients who have a history of diabetes or cardiac disease or other comorbidities, which is when patients have 2 or more medical conditions, they get it the worst, she said. Dr. Fahad Razak, an internal medicine physician at St. Michael's Hospital, said it's difficult to prevent the physical deterioration that occurs in older adults following flu complications. They usually require more oxygen and mobility support since their risk of falls and injuries increases. Quote, "That's the effect of being in a hospital bed for a week or two," he said. "It's not just the initial infection, it's the after effects." The Humber River facility has been seeing more patient transfers from nursing homes this flu season. Dr. Cora said, quote, "I have the normal things that come in like chest pains, heart attacks, and strokes, but on top of that, you get the viral infections and a lot of patients suffering from respiratory symptoms." At St. Michael's, Razak said he notices the effects of the flu have been clustered in older adults. His main concern is that these complications can be vastly reduced. Quote, "There's a disconcerting number of people who I see in hospital who are not vaccinated, who would have clearly benefited from being vaccinated." So take note of that, listeners, that if you have not been vaccinated for the flu, especially if you're 65 or over or 5 or less, please get your vaccination. The early arrival of this flu season could be to blame, said Dr. Leis, since vaccination campaigns were still underway. The executive vice president of clinical programs and quality at Michael Jaron Hospital, who's Kevin Edmondson, said the hospital was, quote, "under significant capacity pressure," close quote, "due to very high patient demand. Inpatient Inpatient occupancy has increased from 110%, to 150% in the past week. Quote, physicians are seeing typical flu symptoms such as fever, cough, breathing difficulties, and dehydration, with higher impacts among older adults and patients with complex medical needs, though children and adults are also being admitted, he said in a statement. Emergency department visits are also higher this time. Emergency department visits are also higher than this time last year, with a, quote, steady increase in patients of all ages coming in with flu and flu-related illness, leading to a higher demand for inpatient beds. This past December, North York General Hospital said it is seeing, quote, an extremely high number of patients of all ages in the emergency department, up 10% from 2024. Several hospitals have implemented masking and hand-washing protocols reminiscent of early COVID-era procedures to protect staff and patients. But the most effective measure against influenza is still vaccination. Dr. Lee said we need to be vigilant as we move forward because this flu is not going away until probably the end of March. Okay. Let's see if we can find, again, maybe something of a lighter note, not Ukraine, if you don't mind. The headline on the Ukraine thing was Russian strikes caused major blackouts in two regions. Here's an article written by the former Canadian ambassador to the UN and an associate at now the Pendleton Group, which is an economic development consulting firm. Her name is Louise Blais, B-L-A-I-S. All right, so she wrote this opinion piece entitled How Canada Should React to the Maduro Capture. I apologize for this not being of a lighter note, but I think it's important to give Canadians some insight into this Venezuelan issue and what the ramifications are for Canada. I guess she didn't, I'm sorry, I don't think Louise Blais wrote this, but she's, I think, probably quoted very closely here. The U.S. operation to seize Venezuelan leader Maduro's The U.S. operation to seize Venezuelan leader to seize him stunned governments around the world. Yet Canada's leaders have been notably cautious, stopping short of openly criticizing the intervention. With high stakes, free trade negotiations looming, the incursion raises a difficult question. Should Canada speak out against an apparent breach of international law, or would doing so risk further damage to an already strained relationship with Washington? In this conversation, two former senior Canadian diplomats debate whether defending international law and sovereignty abroad strengthens or undermines Canada's interests at home. And again, here's Ms. Louise Blais, former Canadian ambassador to the United Nations, talking, as well as the former Canadian ambassador to Venezuela named Ben Roswell. Rosewell. Both individuals agree the U.S. operation violated international law. Amen. But they sharply disagree on what Canada should do next. Rosewell argues Canada must defend its own sovereignty by standing up for sovereignty throughout the Americas, and that the Venezuelan crisis offers an opportunity for principled Canadian leadership. Ms. Blais counters that Ottawa must prioritize national interests at home and navigate relations with Washington carefully and avoid expending political capital where it is unlikely to make a difference. According to Mr. Roswell, Canada has a long tradition of standing up for democracy and human rights in the Americas. He says we should condemn the illegal use of force in Venezuela. He says he feels relief that Maduro, a dictator who committed crimes against his own people, is no longer causing harm, but he also feels dismay that the United States intervened militarily in another country. Under international law, the use of force against another state is permitted only when a UN Security Council resolution or in cases of imminent threat and self-defense. This was a clear-cut crime of aggression. Amen. That's Trump's wheelhouse. Ms. Blaze responds, this was not a traditional invasion. She said she finds it telling that Canada, France, the United Kingdom, and many other countries took a very balanced, careful approach in their reactions. She said, I think Canada's initial response was correct. It took the Prime Minister a long time to make a statement, and I don't begrudge him that. In situations like this, you've got to wait for the smoke to clear. She says, we also have our own vested interests. With the renewal of the CUSMA trade agreement this year, we are not well positioned with the United States. Nobody is well positioned with the United States, thanks to Trump. We spent our goodwill last year with, quote, elbows up, close quote, and the Ontario TV advertisement quoting former U.S. Republican President Ronald Reagan. We have been difficult to deal with because we've stood our ground for better or for worse. The United States is also not asking for Canada's permission. They couldn't care less what Canada thinks. Isn't that nice? We need to avoid further expending any goodwill. We must navigate this moment very carefully. Roswell responds, I would like to emphasize that this was a clear crime of aggression under the United Nations Charter. She, Ms. Blaze, responds, I think we should be focusing on our own national issues. We border Russia. We border the United States. We have a vast country. We've underinvested in our own sovereignty and defense. We now face an economic challenge from U.S. tariffs. I don't think Venezuela is where the Prime Minister should be putting his attention right now. We have a democracy to defend. We have a separatist movements on the rise. There's a lot to keep a Prime Minister occupied at home. Roswell responds that Canada, however, does have a big stake in what's happening in Venezuela because it's about sovereignty, the capacity of citizens to have a degree of control over the decisions that affect their lives. What's happening in Venezuela represents a potential erosion of Canada's own sovereignty. The president has said oil was the reason for the invasion. His national security strategy openly questions the sovereignty of all countries in the Americas with respect to, quote, strategic resources, close quote. Unbelievable. We have also experienced a year of sustained economic attack by the U.S., capped by the president's declaration that he wants Canada to join the United States as a 51st state. Ridiculous. Our silence on Venezuela sends a message that we are prepared to submit to decisions about our resources being made in Washington. Ms. Blaze says, I think that in private, when we speak to the Americans, we should assert that we are in charge of our national resources. We need to go into this year's CUSMA review with eyes open, wide open, about American intentions. But we also need to get the relationship back on better footing, and that may take some humility. Yeah, Trump doesn't get along with anybody unless they grovel first. It may be painful, but I don't see us having a choice. There is also a limit to the effectiveness of poking a finger at Donald Trump. Americans don't care what we say. That's not true. Whether we defend Venezuela or don't defend Venezuela, they won't listen one way or the other. Roswell says, I agree our trading relationship with the U.S. is very important, but free trade with the U.S. is coming to an end because that's how Trump sees the world. He doesn't want to grant market access to other countries. He doesn't see the fundamental logic of free trade making both sides better off. In our trade negotiations this year, Trump will test the degree of sovereignty we are willing to surrender to secure access to the U.S. market. To position ourselves effectively, we need to signal a willingness to walk away from the table. Exactly. That would require contemplating a degree of economic damage we don't want to contemplate. But if we don't, Trump will continue to push us towards a worse outcome. We have seen that flattery doesn't work, says Mr. Roswell regarding Trump. Look at Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, who offered to give her Nobel Peace Prize to Trump, and he dismissed her. In that context, whether we say things that annoy them is immaterial. I agree with you, Louise. Americans don't care what we say one way or the other, so we might as well say what is in our interest to say. Sovereignty is essential, and we will stand up for it everywhere. Well, both make good points. Let me remind you, you are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Let's shift to the advice column, which is always kind of interesting. The first letter to the advice columnist, Lisi Tesher, says, when everything goes wrong, everything goes wrong. I've just come back from the hospital where I've been treated for a broken foot. Ouch. I fell dancing last week. It'll heal, but it sucks because I now must cancel my planned vacation with my boyfriend and another couple. We had everything booked for a ski holiday out west. Flights, accommodation, rentals, lift passes, and now I can't go. I can't even go and sit in the chalet because it's too expensive if you're not skiing. And the way we booked, the only way I can get some money back is to cancel completely and get everything back. So, I'm done. My boyfriend is still going to go, and that sucks because now I'm missing my vacation, and I'm going to be alone, and I don't have any plans to be with friends because I thought I'd be away. And on top of that, I just found out that in the new year, the company I work for is going to be making large cuts. I've only been there a short time, and I'm very junior, so I know my name is on the list of people to let go. Signed, Too Much Rain. Answer, yes. The expression, quote, when it rains it pours, close quote, seems to be very true for you right now. I'm sorry for all the difficulties in your life right now, but I'm here to help. Breaking your foot may have been avoidable, but accidents happen. If this were any other month, it wouldn't have affected your trip, but it has, which makes it all the worse. And it's the holidays, which makes it even worse. I'm assuming you will get all your money back, or at least most of it. Not if her boyfriend can go. So you can start off the new year a little flusher, which is a good thing, especially if you're about to lose your job. Also, since you're home without making much going on, you could start the process of looking for a new job. Good point. Which takes time and mental energy. This way, if you get made redundant at your present job, you're already working on finding something else. It's proactive of you and a time filler while you're home alone. My biggest suggestion would be to get on the phone right away and find out which of your friends are around during the holidays and explain your situation and ask if you can join in on their activities. Stay in touch with your boyfriend, but remember, he'll be on a different time zone and he's there to ski. Early nights and early mornings, therefore. Don't be offended if he can't talk when you call. This is just a blip in your otherwise smooth life. Don't make more out of it than you should. This too shall pass. Let's see what the next letter says. My boyfriend and I just signed a lease on an apartment starting in the new year, and now I don't want to move in with him. Oh boy. We've only been together for 6 months, but we were out walking, and we saw the for rent sign, and we went inside. The place was gorgeous. It ticked all the boxes for both of us. But I barely know him, really. We've only been on one weekend getaway together. Of course, we've had sleepovers, but that's not the same as living with someone. I think we rushed in. What do I do? Signed, Cold Feet. Answer, well, dear Cold Feet, you back out, quickly, even if it means losing 1 month's rent, unless one of you still wants to keep the place alone. I agree. 6 months is a short time to know someone, and moving in together at this point is premature. Many have done it, and it's been successful, but if you're already not feeling it, get out. Okay, well, that's interesting. All right, here's an article relating to recycling. Headline: How will the new blue bin pickup system affect you? Subheadline: Missed collections and misinformation result in a rocky start. For the first time in over 40 years, Toronto's blue bin recycling program is no longer run by the city, but instead run by a new private operator entitled, whose name is Circular Materials, a nonprofit founded to handle recycling on behalf of major brands like McDonald's, Costco, and Loblaws. And it took over the recycling systems in Ontario, including Toronto, on January 1, concluding a 3-year provincial transition marked by industry complaints and recycling standards being watered down. A week into 2026, the launch has been bumpy, with missed pickups and confusing information causing headaches for residents. While you can no longer call the City of Toronto at 311 to fix your blue bin problems, here's a guide on who to contact instead and how the new recycling service provider came into place. Toronto households can recycle the same materials as before, plus some new items, including black plastic containers, hot and cold beverage cups, frozen juice containers, ice cream tubs, deodorant, and toothpaste tubes that can be recycled. Residents can continue to use their current blue bins, and collection days remain the same, except in some neighborhoods of the old City of Toronto, east and west of Yonge Street, where alternating garbage and recycling weeks will change beginning in early January, which is now. Affected residents should have received a notice or can consult the city's 2026 collection schedule. One thing residents may miss is the city's 311 line, which offered around-the-clock support for missed pickups or damaged or missing bins. 311 will no longer handle recycling questions. All calls should be directed to the new Circular Materials hotline, which is, get a pencil, the hotline is 1-888-921-2686. I'll repeat that. The new call, instead of 311 for recycling issues, is 1-888-921-2686, which only operates on weekdays. The nonprofit said it will respond to messages left outside of business hours the next day and handle urgent calls immediately. And the question is now, why is the recycling system being privatized? In the previous system, more than 240 Ontario municipalities ran their own separate blue box programs, sharing costs equally with the so-called, quote, stewards, close quote, the manufacturers, brand holders, and franchisors responsible for producing household glass, plastic, metal, and printed paper products. Doug Ford's government pushed for a transition to an extended producer responsibility system in 2021 to incentivize companies to use more recyclable packaging, making the stewards fully responsible for the cost and administration of recycling. Mr. Ford said the change would save municipalities millions of dollars while diverting more waste from landfills thanks to an expanded list of recyclable materials. However, the execution of the well-intentioned idea has been troublesome and criticized as needlessly bureaucratic. The Environment Ministry granted waste producers a 2-year grace period to make, quote, best efforts, close quote, to meet recycling targets before facing potential fines, and delayed plans to expand blue box recycling to apartments, condos, long-term care, and retirement homes by 5 years. So, interesting stuff. I think that concludes our reading for today. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the current Toronto Star, dated as of today. Your reader has been George Collins. Thank you very much for listening, and I will wish you the best going forward and talk to you soon.